Welcome, everybody. We're just going to wait a few moments to let the room fill up. We'll give it about 30 seconds or so. Looks like we're getting a lot of folks online. Okay, and we will start in just a second. Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Kelly Vlahos, and I am honored to introduce today's panel, Over the Horizon Operations, the Future of Drone Strikes, and our stellar guests, Representative Ilhan Omar, who will be joining us shortly, Annie Shiel, and Hina Shamsi. My colleague, Adam Weinstein, will be moderating the discussion in just a moment. If you don't know much about the Quincy Institute, we are a transpartisan think tank dedicated to a new foreign policy and national security strategy focused on diplomacy rather than American military primacy abroad. We were staunch advocates of the Afghanistan military withdrawal and just as committed to seeing through a resolution to the humanitarian strife occurring there now. We are also watching closely to see whether ending the war in Afghanistan truly means ending endless war in the region. Much of the talk on Capitol Hill today is how the lack of boots on the ground in Afghanistan will affect the U.S. counterterrorism mission in the region, with a renewed focus on ISIS and al-Qaeda offshoots that the military says is still plaguing Central Asia, East Africa, and the greater Middle East. Our panelists today will tackle the very question of whether that mission is still salient and necessary, and if so, what is the meaning of so-called over-the-horizon capabilities? Will the drone war continue? And if so, how can the military guarantee a limit on civilian casualties and blowback? The August 30th airstrike in Kabul, which went from a righteous strike to, in the words of General Mark Milley, to an admitted mistake, is just the latest example of how the U.S. drone program is not a panacea for clean, humane, precision warfare. So a lot to unpack here, and I would love to get right into it. So I'll formally introduce our panel, and then I'm going to hand this all over to Adam. So I'd like to introduce Hina Shamsi first. She is the director of the ACLU National Security Project, which is dedicated to ensuring that U.S. national security policies and practices are consistent with the Constitution, civil liberties, and human rights. She engages in litigation, research, and policy advocacy on a range of issues, including use of force, torture, and unlawful detention. She is the author and co-author of publications on surveillance, targeted killing, torture, and extraordinary rendition. She is also a lecturer in law at Columbia Law School, where she teaches a course on international human rights. Annie Shiel is a senior advisor for U.S. policy and advocacy at the Center for Civilians in Conflict. Annie leads civics work engaging with U.S. policymakers, lawmakers, and advocates to enhance the protection of civilians in conflict. This includes leading civics policy analysis and advocacy around the civilian harm implications of U.S. military operations and security assistance, and building and working with coalitions of like-minded organizations. Shiel has a master's degree in international policy from Stanford University and a BA in international development from McGill University. She is also a Truman National Security Fellow. And Adam Weinstein, our moderator for today, is a research fellow at the Quincy Institute. His current research focuses on security, trade, and rule of law in Afghanistan and Pakistan. He is a member of the American Pakistan Foundation's Leadership Council and previously worked as a senior law and policy analyst at the National Iranian American Council, where he focused on the securitization of U.S. immigration policy and its effect on immigrant communities. Adam also served as a U.S. Marine and deployed to Afghanistan in 2012. So Adam, I know that we were awaiting the Congresswoman, and I'm sure you'll introduce her as she comes in, but I'm going to hand off this conversation to you at this point so we can get on, and thank you for inviting me to introduce today's discussion.
Thanks for that introduction, Kelly. we're in an era of unprecedented airstrikes. Airwars.org, which tracks these airstrikes and I think has a pretty conservative methodology for tracking both the number of strikes and the civilian harm, has found that the United States itself has declared at least 91,340 strikes. So that's 91,340 strikes across 7 major conflict zones in the last 20 years. And those are just the strikes that the United States has declared. There may be strikes that the United States has not declared. Now, of course, not all of those strikes are drone strikes. Some of those are conventional airstrikes. But the topic of drone strikes is temporarily in the spotlight, and hopefully it stays in the spotlight for a while. And the reason is because of the strike that we all witnessed on August 29th, which killed Zamari Ahmadi, who was working for a US-based NGO, and it also killed 9 members of his family, including 7 children. Now, this strike was particularly egregious because it was a strike on a white Toyota Corolla, and apparently that was one of the identifying factors for the strike. This is a vehicle that makes up 80 to 90% of all vehicles in Kabul, and the color white is the most popular color because Kabul is such a dusty city, and white shows less dust. And so critics of this strike have pointed out to just how faulty the intelligence was, and not just how faulty the intelligence was, but just how flawed the logic behind that intelligence gathering was. And so Central Command initiated an investigation after the New York Times conducted their own investigation, and other media outlets, followed suit and conducted their own investigations. Because of those investigations, Central Command initiated an investigation, and they found that they had messed up, and they called it a tragic mistake, and they had killed 10 innocent people. This prompted Secretary of Defense Austin to ask the Pentagon to initiate its own broader investigation that would look into accountability measures that need to be taken, the degree to which strike authorities need to be altered, and the procedures and processes that need to be altered in the future. And in addition to that, the White House itself is in the process of conducting a review of drone policy, and they may release their own policy. So we essentially have 2 investigations going on at the same time, or 2 reviews, you could say, going on at the same time into what drone policy should be. And hopefully during this panel, we can look backwards at where we failed and also look to the future for where we could improve. And Annie, I want to start with you because you published in Just Security today about this so-called drone playbook that the Biden administration is in the process of developing, and where you think it's going to head. So I'm wondering if you could give us some insights about where that review is going.
I can't give you a lot of insights because we don't know very much, but we do know a few things. We know that Biden and others in the Biden administration continue to use this term over the horizon. And we also know that reporting from the New York Times has suggested that a new Biden drone playbook initially was planned for release around the 9/11 anniversary, but was delayed. And that announcement would have continued the lethal strikes program, the drone program, in a combination of Obama and Trump era policies. And I think as a starting point, we just need to be really clear when we talk about the phrase over the horizon, that words really matter, and that I think the Biden administration is being really clever in using new words to talk about the same thing, right? Which is another US president who is claiming the power to use force anywhere in the world, including outside recognized war zones, through this lethal strikes program that has caused devastating levels of civilian harm without adequate investigations, acknowledgements, amends, or accountability. And as you mentioned, Adam, the devastating strike in Kabul has given the world a glimpse of the impact of drone strikes on civilians. And I do think it's important, again, for people to really recognize that the civilian harm caused by that strike is really heartbreakingly not exceptional, but is in fact very familiar to civilians who have lost loved ones in similar strikes all around the world. And that is what Biden is talking about when he talks about over the horizon capabilities.
Hina, you've been a critic of drone strikes before they were in the headlines. You've been writing about drone strikes and studying drone strikes for years. You've been very clear that the United States should not be engaging in what amounts to extrajudicial killings abroad. What led you to these conclusions? And how do you see the future of the US approach to drone strikes under the Biden administration?
Thanks so much, Adam, and thanks very much for having me. So the first drone strike that took place under these sort of new claimed authorities, although we didn't know it at the time, was back in 2002 under the Bush administration, and that took place in Yemen. And what was very striking at the time was that the United States wasn't engaged in an armed conflict in Yemen, right? We weren't at war, and yet there was a claim that the US could kill someone, terrorism suspect, without comply, in violation, in fact, of the rules that apply to limit extrajudicial arbitrary killing, and yet was claiming sort of war authority to do that. And that really became a hallmark of what developed under the Obama administration, far more expansively, and then was continued under the Trump administration. And it is the claim to be able to use lethal force under a made-up set of rules outside of recognized armed conflict. And my initial engagement with this was, oh wow, this is a one-off, but this could really destabilize the international system that protects peace and security and safeguards individual life from arbitrary killing if it gets any worse. And lo and behold, that's what it did. And what we have now is, close to 2 decades worth of experience in which claims of presidential power have expanded with a veneer of policy safeguards that have never been good enough, because they also don't comply with the law, and that have caused devastating harm primarily to Black, brown, and Muslim people, also contributed to destabilization and migration and refugee crises, because that's how the program started in Yemen, which is now one of the worst humanitarian crises facing us. So my concern began with a real fear about what was happening to a system, and pretty soon was caught up by the fact that it was happening to people. And I will say this, it's not only drones. In the popular imagination and in reality, a lot of times we talk about drones, but they've used other weapons platforms, including helicopter gunships, for these kinds of strikes. So it is now risking to be now an entrenched program that we will talk about.
So I'm wondering if you could walk us through what you describe as a made-up set of rules. And we had the presidential policy guidance under the Obama administration, and then under the Trump administration, we had what was known as the PSP, or the procedures for U.S. direct action against terrorist targets. Is this where these made-up rules come from, and why do you call them made up?
So the made-up rules were articulated in a number of different places, and under the Obama administration, they started being articulated in a set of speeches by top government officials. What we're talking about, and I'm really not going to use playbook. I feel like there's a lot of euphemism that happens around here that can feel to me, obscene. Over the horizon, playbook, and I'm going to talk about another term in a bit, but what it really does boil down to is claims of legal authority to use lethal force outside of areas where the United States is engaged in an armed conflict, cobbling together permissive rules under a different set of legal frameworks that are supposed to safeguard life and international peace and security, self-defense under the UN Charter, or a veneer of due process from a combination of domestic and international law, to terms that echo human rights standards while violating them, and then to terms that draw upon the laws of war authorities, even where they don't apply. So what it is, and I've sort of talked about it sometimes, it's a cherry-picked mishmash from different legal frameworks that the United States has cobbled together that virtually no other country agrees with in its entirety. And what the Obama administration did is well, let me say another commonality is that no administration has set out to make those rules public, right? They are kept secret, and it's taken litigation by the ACLU and the New York Times to force them to be disclosed in still redacted form. And what the Obama administration did was that it had the PPG for areas outside of active hostilities, which is another made-up term that was meant to apply not to recognized armed conflict in Afghanistan, and then later Iraq, and then later Syria, but Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, Libya. And that's part of what's so problematic. It goes back to what Annie was talking about, which is there's no real limit to this claim of authority, right? It is policy veneers that are the limit, but the legal claims have no meaningful limit in terms of where they apply. And then the Obama administration came up with standards that it sort of tightened over time with each scandal, a requirement that near certainty had to be met, that your standard was, the target was present. And we know how weak those rules were because along comes the Trump administration and issues a new set of rules, which it takes litigation to force open. And you see those rules, and the signals are right from the beginning, characteristic of the Trump administration, bellicose. It's giving more authority at theater levels, but the claims are essentially the same. And the policy safeguards that the Obama administration tried to put in place by the end of 2016 to limit civilian casualties were all too easy for the Trump administration to blow through. And the number of strikes went up, and the number of civilian casualties went up.
Yeah, in fact, there were more strikes in 2019 in Afghanistan than any year before that, which I don't think the public usually knows. And it strikes me that the US government has relied on these strikes being out of sight and out of mind. Very few organizations have the resources like the ACLU or the New York Times to engage in costly litigation to try to get this information revealed. And I want to talk to you about this, Annie, because your organization has really focused on trying to bring the human cost of these strikes into the open, into the daylight. But do you feel that you're up against this sort of veil of secrecy that is very much intentional?
Yeah, so the Department of Defense has in recent years been required by Congress to report annually the number of civilian casualties caused in US operations. And I want to be clear that this reporting is focused on the Department of Defense. So there's this whole other world of covert operations where we have no transparency about the harm that is being caused and the strikes that are happening. But when it comes to DoD numbers, we still even there see a significant year after year undercount of civilian casualties in that annual reporting. And by that, I mean there is a persistent gap between the numbers that the military is reporting and the numbers coming out of credible NGO observers like Air Wars, who you cited at the beginning. And even in the past year, they were disagreeing with numbers coming out of the United Nations. And what's especially frustrating about that is that these external observers, so human rights organizations, media organizations, again, the UN, usually have significantly more rigorous methods for investigating cases of civilian harm than the US military. So they are actually on the ground talking to witnesses, they are visiting the sites of attacks, They are collecting evidence, often at great peril to themselves. And they're collecting all this information that the US military doesn't have access to. And that's especially obviously the case when we are talking about these air-centric campaigns, including drone and other strikes. We also did research with Columbia Law School's Human Rights Institute. We reviewed hundreds of investigations, and we found in all of those investigations that the DoD demonstrated consistent bias towards its own internal information, right? So that means that, and that bias actually got stronger as the US turned more towards air-centric campaigns. So that means that, the US has less information about what's happening on the ground, but is more, is undervaluing information from NGOs and overvaluing its own information, which is the very information that led it to undertake a strike in the first place. And that's the information they're using to determine whether civilian casualties occurred or not.
So I want to read off some numbers because I think the numbers are important here for folks to understand the kind of disparities we're talking about. Under the NDAA in 2018, these reporting requirements were established and they've continued. And now since 2020, I think the DoD has to publish allegations of civilian harm in addition to its own conclusions of civilian harm. But these disparities you're talking about are quite high. For example, for 2020, the DoD reported that US forces killed 23 civilians and injured 10 more in Afghanistan, Somalia, and Iraq. But Air Wars estimated 102 civilian deaths in 2020 across 5 countries. So
and I'm so sorry, Adam, but that's Air Wars' most conservative estimate.
That's their most conservative estimate. And so it might be much higher than that, but the minimum is 5 times what the DoD is reporting, which is already crazy. And it could be a lot more than that. And then if you start to look at, if you don't trust Air Wars, let's see what the UN has to say. In 2020 in Afghanistan, the Pentagon reported 20 civilian deaths and 5 civilian injuries. And the United Nations mission in Afghanistan, that is actually supported by the United States itself, reported that international forces killed at least 89 civilians and injured 31 in 2020. Granted, that was for all international forces, but of course, the United States made up the most active component of that. So these are big disparities. We're not talking about 5%. We're talking about huge disparities here. And what do you think? Do you think this is intentional, Annie, or do you think this is a shoddy methodology on the part of the Pentagon, or do you think they've begun to essentially internalize their own biases in a way which you sort of suggested already?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it does come down to the assumptions that the DoD makes. I think we actually saw this play out again really heartbreakingly in the Kabul strike, right, where the DoD literally surveilled Zamari Ahmadi all day, and still every single thing they saw was clouded by the initial assessment that they made, which was fundamentally false. And that happens all over the world. And again, they're using the same information. They're using that internal information to determine whether civilian casualties happened at all later. And so I do think it's a fundamental lack of humility often to take external information and realize that something went really horribly wrong.
Can I just jump in there with just a couple more thoughts, just that are also sort of historical in this way, which is that, DoD takes the position that it doesn't have to count until Congress essentially made it in the context even of armed conflict and publicized, let alone for the numbers, outside of armed conflict, that the mandated reporting requirements are because it was refusing to make this information public, right? And that goes, I think, to a more broad, if we're thinking about, Kelly talked about ending the forever wars, the endless wars. And our country has made a real habit of discounting the human costs and consequences, whether in the recognized armed conflict in Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria, or in outside areas of active hostilities, to use the Obama administration terms. And so it becomes entirely focused on its own goals and, the numbers and the metrics that justify preconceived notions of what is and is not legitimate and tactical. But meanwhile, there's no broader consideration of what the strategy is, right? Of what the human costs are, of I'm thinking about, the waves of harm and damage that flow from each wrong. And it's so powerful to read the words of Shahzad Akbar, for example, who says that impunity for lethal strikes that killed civilians in Afghanistan is one of those things that increased resentment and turned people against the Afghan government itself, to what's happening outside of recognized armed conflict, where there's virtually no recognition at all, no meaningful investigation, no meaningful compensation for people. And that's where we stand. So I really am, that's part of the tragedy and the outrage, I think, of this 20-year-long approach.
And of course, that strike in Kabul got attention precisely because it was in Kabul. But when you look at places like Helmand Province or rural parts of Yemen, these places didn't get attention because there was nobody there to pay attention. And in fact, we just at Quincy Institute just did a Q&A with an investigative journalist, Jack Murphy, who used to be in the Special Forces, who looked into these strikes in Helmand Province. And one strike in particular essentially hit the wrong target. There was a vehicle driving into an intersection at the same time that the intended target reached that intersection. 3 people were killed, two adult males and a child, and they only marked the child as the civilian casualty. In this targeted human strike, they marked the 2 adults who weren't Taliban, or at least nobody knew that they were Taliban, but they essentially marked them as enemy. And look, I deployed to Afghanistan. In fact, I was in Southwest Afghanistan. I was based in Uruzgan. Jack deployed to Afghanistan. We were not in Afghanistan as peacemakers. We were there to kill the enemy. And it shocked us. It certainly seemed to shock Jack. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he seemed shocked by it. And I was shocked when I heard it. And this is the reality of what a lot of the airstrikes, including by conventional forces, looked like in places like Afghanistan that were out of sight and out of mind. But I want to bring in an audience question, and it's an interesting question. And this audience member says that their impression looking at the data on drone strikes is that a disproportionate amount of civilian deaths from US airstrikes come from drones as opposed to manned aircraft. But I wonder if the real issue there is having folks on the ground. I mean, we began to engage in air war in Afghanistan where there was nobody on the ground. Our soldiers were not in combat. Our partner forces were not in combat. We were essentially flying drones over vast amounts of territory looking for people to kill because we had this metrics-driven air war. And do you think that makes a difference, either of you?
I'm not going to fully answer that question, but I'm going to try, but I do really want to quickly go back to something that you raised earlier, which is I think the really important point about the fact that the strike in Kabul got the attention it got because it was in Kabul, but it was also because the New York Times was reporting in Kabul. And it's not completely true that there aren't organizations reporting from rural parts of Yemen, for example, but they're not getting the attention that they deserve. So What's Enough for Human Rights, for example, is a Yemeni human rights organization. They have done enormous amounts of research and investigation into US drone strikes in Yemen. Again, going to various parts of Yemen at great peril to themselves. They have submitted large numbers of rigorously researched, again, using the highest standards. So not everything they had, a lot of information that they've submitted to the Department of Defense regarding specific civilian casualties. And only one single civilian casualty that they submitted was confirmed. And to your point, Adam, a lot of the civilian casualties that they researched and submitted to the DoD that were not recognized, were not confirmed, were those that included children. So in those cases, the DoD said, no, those are not civilians.
That's really baffling that they were saying that children were combatants and not civilians. And the only type of oversight we've gotten has been their own oversight. So we're essentially asking the DoD to regulate itself. Am I wrong?
Not wrong, but also if you look at the methodology over time, there was an embedded presumption that the person killed was a legitimate target. So with that presumption, among the things that we've all been sort of fighting with the US government for a number of years now is how to overturn that presumption and what credit they give to their own evidence, which often is deeply imperfect, and what credit they will give to evidence from independent human rights groups, media, and family members themselves when it challenges that received presumption. I'm wondering if we should pause or just keep going.
I just wanted to ask, am I wrong to think that the evidence is, well, actually, I'm sorry. I see that Congresswoman Omar is in here. That's what you meant. Okay, we should pause. And I want to turn to the Congresswoman. Congresswoman, thanks for joining us. I know you have a very busy schedule right now, but we are really happy that you have some time to join us. And after this most recent strike in Kabul that killed 10 people, including 7 children, during a hearing in which Secretary Blinken testified, you said to Secretary Blinken, and I quote, "It is not unusual for US drone strikes to kill civilians, and it is not unusual for the US government to claim it killed terrorists instead." And I'd like to ask you, what has shaped your perception, both as a lawmaker and as a Somali American woman, about drone strikes? And how do you see US drone policy going forward? What changes do we need to make as a country, and how can we reconcile the unjust deaths that we've already committed in our name?
First, just thank you, Adam, and everyone at the Quincy Institute for inviting me to participate in this really important conversation. I'm especially excited to be sharing this panel with Hina and Annie, who have both been doing such good work on this for a really long time. I'm a survivor of war. I was a child who knew what it was like to hear bombs going outside of your home and wondering if you are next. And I can only imagine the terror of automated drones circling around your home, knowing that at any point you can be taken out, or your entire family can be taken out. So it's really a timely discussion that we are having. I think we all realize that the only thing truly extraordinary about the strike in Kabul was that it happened at a time when all eyes were on Afghanistan. So outlets like the New York Times and Washington Post and CNN had teams on the ground who could do quick and thorough investigation. But so many of the details of the strike, especially the Pentagon's earliest statements about the strike, are really familiar to us, especially those of us who've been following the drone program closely. The truth is, this happens all the time. There is very little oversight, very little in the way of investigations. The military's accounting of civilian casualties and civilian harm is always way less than the work the UN does, or NGOs like the ACLU or Civil and others do. And while I'm very grateful that there are organizations and journalists who are putting in the work to really get to the truth about who's being killed by our drone program, and the Pentagon remains in denial about civilian harm until the public record becomes overwhelming. If you look at this Kabul strike, it was reported last week that the Pentagon has offered condolence payments to the families of the victims. Congress appropriated money for these payments to happen every single year. Just before the Kabul strike that got everyone's attention, it was reported that the Pentagon paid out $0 in 2020. That's not just for Afghanistan, but for all of the places where we're conducting drone strikes that are killing civilians. So even when the evidence is overwhelming, the Pentagon does not take the minimum effort to make it right. What's different this time is that it's been a big news story, which is unusual. And I'll add that Congressman Khanna and Senator Warren have really been taking the lead and doing extraordinary work on conducting oversight over the failures to make these payments. Of course, the goal here is not simply to provide condolence payments to the families of people we kill. The goal is for there not to be families in mourning who have to who we have to offer this in the first place. I know your question earlier was how my position has been informed by the fact that I come from Somalia, which is one of the countries we are conducting these strikes. And I would also add that it's one of the countries where the military only admitted to killing civilians after the exhaustive reporting by Amnesty International and others forced them to. I'm very aware of the threat posed to peace and stability by the ongoing conflict with Al-Shabaab. I desperately, obviously, want to see this conflict come to end and know that many are directly impacted by the actions of Al-Shabaab on the ground. And that is why I'm so critical of the drone program that has shown no evidence of all of it bringing this conflict to see an end. I always say we can't drone ourselves out of terrorism. And if you talk to people on the ground in Somalia, people who are doing really amazing work towards peace building and reconciliation and re-radicalization, tell you that every civilian casualty sets us back. Everyone makes peace. Every one of them makes peace to be more distant. For 20 years, we've been trying to drone the problem to death, and we have to acknowledge that it is not working. In many cases, we are doing much more harm than good. In Somalia, as well as the Sahel and other parts of Africa, we repeatedly make the mistake that we've done with the war in Afghanistan. We know that in Somalia and many of the operations in Africa, the Pentagon is calling the shot in terms of policy. Our diplomats and development workers don't go out into communities. And, if AFRICOM says there's a threat, nobody has any way of verifying it. And if they say the people that were killed are combatants, there is really no way of knowing, or it takes an extraordinary effort to prove them wrong. And as we saw with the strike in Kabul, they always, their first response is to say that they've killed terrorists, which we know not to be true. The last thing I want to say before we continue is that there's been some incredible whistleblowers from the inside of the military who have been sounding the alarm on this for many years. And I want to just take a moment to honor them. I think they're patriots in the truest sense of the word. As you know, I wrote to President Biden asking him to pardon Danielle Hale. And I hope that others will join me in that effort. There is just a lot still unknown and a lot of work that still needs to get done. I know that when the president and the leaders in the Pentagon, even especially the State Department, take to the podium and say that we have an over the horizon capacity that is precise, that they are in many ways lying to the American public, and we have to be able to have a continued conversation about just how precise their capacity is and how deadly it has been, and how our war on terror in regards to our drone program has been counterproductive. One of the things that I recently talked about was that, especially in Africa, before we started our war on terror, there were 0 designated terrorist groups operating in Africa. And right now there's more than 10. So in the span of 20 years, we've actually seen the creation of 10 terrorist designated organizations on a continent where zero used to exist before we began our war on terror. And so accountability and reckoning with our policies and how counterproductive they've been is going to be really necessary. With that, thank you.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I'm wondering if I could ask one follow-up, which is, what can Americans of conscience who want to see a change in these policies, who want to see civilian victims and their families of past strikes given some kind of restitution, and who want to prevent the destruction of future families by U.S. bombs, what can they do to try to bring about change in Congress and in the White House?
Yeah, so two things. I think in regards to compensation for families that have been victimized by our drone program. We obviously need every member of Congress to continue to ask the question of the Pentagon on why these resources haven't gone out, right? Why are they just now announcing the families that are impacted in Kabul airstrike will get that, and haven't announced for the other families in Afghanistan, in Somalia, and in the Sahel region that have been impacted as well. So that's one. And I think the second is to not take things at face value, to make sure that their members of Congress really understand that, as their constituents, they want them to be asking questions of the drone program, of the war on terror, of whether it is counterproductive or not. These are our tax dollars that are going to kill people in the name of our safety. And you want your member to ask the question, are we being made safer by these policies or not? And if they don't have an answer for you, ask them not to continue to vote for these policies to continue to be funded. There is an opportunity every single year and multiple times a year for members of Congress to vote against funding going towards these programs that continue to perpetuate harm around the world in the name of the safety of Americans.
Well, thank you for that answer. And I hope people who do question the efficacy of these strikes write to their lawmakers, call their lawmakers, and demand some kind of oversight and hopefully change. And I think you've been a real effective advocate in keeping this in the conversation, even when it wasn't in the headlines, even before it was in the headlines.
I mean, I will just say, I think oftentimes when I am talking about it, people will say, it's not happening here. Why do you care? Why do you care who's getting killed in, some country in Somalia or in the Sahel region or Afghanistan or Iraq or, all of the other parts of the world that were involved in killing people. And it's that you want to make sure that your tax dollars are, one, not going to killing innocent people. And two, you also want to not have that on your conscience. You don't want innocent people being killed in your name, because when the United States government is sponsoring these deaths, they are sponsoring them in our name. They are saying, we are protecting the American people. This is for the safety of the American people. And they are doing it with our consent. And so if you don't want to consent to it, you have to make sure you are educating yourself, you're advocating against these harmful policies, and that you are asking your member of Congress to be your representative in doing the oversight work that they are constitutionally mandated to do.
In other words, there's no way to be apolitical on this issue. You can't be on the sidelines on this issue.
Absolutely not.
Well, thank you for your insights, Congresswoman, and for your continued fight to have a more just national security policy.
Thank you.
Sorry, Annie, I wanted to bring you in to talk about something that the Congresswoman had brought up, which was these payments, these restitution payments that are made to the families that have been destroyed by some of these strikes. And you've talked about how even internationally recognized NGOs have trouble reaching the point of contact in government to get these funds dispersed. I mean, Congress has already allocated these funds to be paid to the victims of these strikes. And yet, as the Congresswoman noted, no payments have been made in 2020. Why is that? Why is it so hard? Why, even this most recent strike, I don't think payments have been made yet to the family in Kabul. In fact, Hina, I know the ACLU is representing the NGO that employed the man who was murdered by this strike in Kabul. So why is it so difficult, even in the face of overwhelming evidence of a strike that killed an innocent person, for families and communities to get restitution?
So, I mean, you started with the question of, what happens if you are an NGO trying to advocate for these payments, or a civilian in one of these communities. And in order to even consider making a payment, the way that the DoD process works, first they have to, do an assessment and investigation and confirm that civilian harm occurred. So first you have to go through all the hurdles that I talked about earlier, right? Where the DoD is not doing these investigations, they're not including interviews and site visits and things like that. So even there, like figuring out where to submit a claim to DoD, that is a huge challenge, even for organizations like ours, let alone a civilian in rural Yemen, for example, or in Somalia, who's trying to figure out what happened, what happened to a loved one. But then to your question about these payments, so yes, I think it's really important, as the Congresswoman mentioned, that Congress has allocated $3 million a year in the NDAA recently to make these ex gratia payments to civilians harmed in U.S. operations. And as she noted, in 2020, they revealed that not a single payment was made that year, despite the availability of this funding. And what's really important, you asked, why is that? What's really important is that is despite the fact that there are a large number of cases from 2020 and older years where the DoD had confirmed that civilian casualties occurred, where they have the means to contact survivors, where they know the identity of victims and survivors. And so it's not a capacity issue. It's not an issue of having the tools. And so, we've been working on this for a long time and sorting through this issue. And I really have to land on the fact that it's a problem of political will, right? They have the means to make these payments. They call it, it's up to commander's discretion. So they can make that decision as soon as they've confirmed that a civilian casualty occurred. And they didn't do that even once in 2020.
So they just don't care, is what you're really saying.
I think that there are people that care, but overwhelmingly it looks like no, there is not a will. They do not care to make these payments the way that they could. And what's really important is that we know from experience that proper amends, which includes these payments and can include other assistance as well, make a real difference in people's lives, right? A payment can never bring back the death of a loved one. But when those decisions, when assistance and payments are centered on the agency and the dignity and the decisions of victims and survivors, they make a big difference in people's lives. And the answer is no, they have chosen not to make those payments.
Yeah, I want to talk about, the payments obviously don't make these families whole again. And I want to talk about what the real harm is here, because we're not just talking about losing a family member. We're talking about trauma that affects entire communities. Representative Omar talked about the fear of hearing bombs and how she can't imagine how scary it must be to hear a drone. And as a Marine in Afghanistan, I know that we were always concerned when we had a drone on station about buzzing the target. In other words, we would want to keep drones offset on the other side of mountains, for example, until we were ready to engage in some kind of close air support, because we didn't want to buzz the target. And if you've ever heard a drone in person, and I've heard a drone in person in Afghanistan, it sounds like a lawnmower way in the distance. But unlike a lawnmower, it's associated with death. So you have these communities who are living in Afghanistan or Yemen, and imagine you hear this sound that sounds like a very faint lawnmower above you. You can't see it, but you know it's there, and you don't know what's going to come next. And what is the harm that comes to communities that live under that kind of surveillance and targeted human killing for years on end?
So, yes, all of the above. We've heard about, as you mentioned, cases where people are haunted by the sounds of aircraft above. They are afraid to leave their home on clear days. And I actually wrote down, I mentioned watching the Yemeni organization earlier, a quote from an interview that they did when they were investigating drone strikes. They interviewed a Yemeni mother, and she said, "My 6-year-old son wanted to go to the bathroom, but then returned without going. When I asked him the reason, he said, 'I don't want you all to die without me if the drone hits.'" And that is a 6-year-old child. So, I mean, the psychological impact, the harm, the trauma is, it's hard to wrap my head around as someone who has not lived through that. But yes, it is permanent.
Hina, I want to talk to you about something, because I think, when we hear stories about a child reacting that way, or we hear stories about an NGO worker being killed, it's easy for us to empathize with the victim. But then the ACLU has not only defended the NGO or advocated for the NGO that employed the man who was killed in Kabul. The ACLU has also advocated for the family of the al-Awlaki victims. I think for some Americans, they think, well, if a drone strike kills a bad guy, even if it's an extrajudicial strike, what's the problem with that? And I'm wondering if you could let us know, what is the problem with that?
Well, before I do that, as you said, the ACLU represents NEI, which is the employer of Zamarai, Ahmadi, and family members. And I want to emphasize certain things. Just, ever since the August 29th strike, just the very clear infliction of traumatic harm that goes in circles and circles of people impacted, especially when you have that number of children. But with the NEI strike was another thing that was unusual and that became so very powerful, is that you had an NGO, US-based NGO, that was able to work with foreign journalists on the ground, essentially to do their own investigation, right? The stigma of suspicion, which continued going with the Defense Department statement for days on end, that's a big part of what we're talking about. The reason that I'm using this as an example as well is because this program is one that is justified on the basis, outside of, Afghanistan context in the most part, of being aimed at terrorism suspects. These are not people who have been found guilty in any court of law. The government hasn't even charged the basics of a criminal indictment against virtually all of them, right? And that for us was the basis for our representation of family members of Americans who were designated as suspects, put on kill lists, and the only justification of due process that the administration provided was the only process that they are due is what we decide within the executive branch, right? And that was a very, very dangerous notion. The claimed power of the president to act as judge, jury, and executioner. And that was why the ACLU started with the, a lawsuit that said, what is your basis? The initial lawsuit was filed before the administration was even providing more fulsome legal bases. What is your legal basis for being able to do this? Because this is a violation of the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution, due process. And after the deaths, which of course included Abdul Rahman al-Alaki, who's a 16-year-old boy from Denver, Colorado, who no one accused of wrongdoing, the families wanted to know why, and how does the Constitution not protect people against being killed without charge or trial? And that's why we supported that lawsuit, both because it went to this very, very fundamental question of what power does the president have? And I'll just end with this. Congresswoman Omar had wonderful things and suggestions about what we can do and what people can do. What we're asking for is for President Biden to end this program, the one of using lethal force even outside of recognized armed conflict. And Annie and I are part of, over 113 groups from around the world and the United States, including from impacted countries, that have come together and say, enough is enough. What you're doing is unlawful, unjustified, and it is so harmful for our communities. And then I think in the longer term, Congress is considering bipartisan legislation that overhauls war powers, that would prevent presidents from being able to launch perpetual wars without end, and reimpose, what our system of checks and balances requires, which is that Congress has to sign off, so that we're not in the kind of place that we've been in for the last 20 years. There are solutions to what the government sometimes seems to pose as intractable things, and the solutions do not include killing our way to peace and security.
Yeah, but we're dealing with a government that was willing to kill a 16-year-old US citizen without due process. And so it doesn't strike me as odd that they're willing to kill the faceless victims of non-US citizens in these targeted human strikes. Do you think it's possible for there to be reform from within, or do you think absent Congress taking back its authority to authorize these strikes, we're going to just see a continuation of this?
I think we need all of it. When I first started doing this work way too many years ago, I didn't realize how generational it would be. I didn't realize just how expansive the claims would be. And very quickly, I became disabused of whatever innocence there was left. But it takes all of this. It needs congressional war powers overhaul because checks and balances is broken. Congress has failed to serve as a meaningful check. It needs us to push the Biden administration to stop this program that is unlawful, unwise, strategically harmful, and really has human costs. And then we need to figure out a way to prevent these kinds of things from happening again, because it may be challenging, but it is absolutely necessary. And there's no magic solution to all of this. It requires the various different things, immediate and long-term, to prevent another Yemen, Pakistan, Somalia, the multiple other countries in which these programs have been carried out, let alone the harms and consequences of the recognized wars.
Well, I'm going to give you the last word, Hina, with that, and pass it over to my colleague, Kelly. Thank you both for your insights. And I know that the Congresswoman has left, but I want to thank her as well.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you, Hina and Annie, for that wonderful discussion, and grateful that the Congresswoman could pop in, and really appreciated her remarks as well. It just seems like there's a lot of unresolved issues here, and maybe we're going to have everyone back when we start seeing this Biden strategy take form, because we don't know and what shape it will be in. I just want to, before people pop off the panel, just to announce that we have a new event that we just put on the schedule, October 27th at 10 a.m. Climate change, the greatest national security threat to the United States. It'll feature our grand strategy senior fellow Anatol Liebin, who is the author of Climate Change in the Nation State. And he'll be joined by guest Netta Crawford, who is the professor and chair of the Department of Political Science at Boston University, and John Conger, who is, among other things, senior U.S. advisor to the International Military Council on Climate and Security. And our new Director of Studies, Sarang Shidore, will moderate that discussion. So I think it's going to be really cool. So thank you, everyone who joined us today on this program. Thanks to our fantastic panel and wonderful moderator, Adam, and we hope to see everybody soon. Please check back on a Quincy Institute website